The financial industry needs you to believe you've already lost, not because it's true, because hopeless people don't ask questions. Here's what the charts never show you. The math of starting late is brutal, but the math of never starting is permanent. There's a version of retirement advice that gets shared millions of times a year. It shows you two lines on a graph, one for the person who started at 25, one for the person who started at 45. The gap between them is enormous. The message is clear. And it's designed to make you feel one specific thing: shame. What nobody explains is why that shame exists, who benefits from it, and what actually happens to the people who feel it and act anyway. By the end of this, you'll understand something the retirement industry doesn't advertise. Late starters have a different set of tools. Not better tools, but real ones. And most people never pick them up. I've spent a long time studying why people make the financial decisions they make at every stage of life. The pattern isn't about income or timing. It's about which story someone decides to believe about themselves. Section 1. The chart is real. The conclusion isn't. Let's start with what's actually true. If two people invest the same amount every month, one for 40 years, one for 15, the person with 40 years wins, by a lot. Compounding rewards time above almost everything else, and nobody should pretend otherwise. But here's what those comparisons almost never account for. The 25-year-old investor in the example is a fiction. The median net worth for Americans in their 20s sits below $40,000. Most are paying off student debt, covering rent in cities that are increasingly unaffordable, building careers that haven't peaked. The person who actually has a few $100s a month to invest, consistently, month after month, through job changes and car repairs and family emergencies, is usually in their 40s or 50s. The comparison isn't between you and some disciplined 25-year-old. It's between you and a character from a brochure. This is where it gets genuinely strange. The people most paralyzed by late start shame are often the people most capable of doing something about it. They have more income than they did at 30. Their largest expenses, mortgages, childcare, college tuitions, are shrinking or gone. They know themselves better. They know what matters. They've survived enough to understand that money isn't the point, but the security it buys absolutely is. The chart told them they failed. It never told them what they still have. Section 2. The tools nobody advertises. Here's something the retirement industry buries in footnotes. The U.S. tax code was specifically designed to give late starters a way to catch up. If you're 50 or older, you can contribute significantly more to a 401k than younger investors. In 2026, that ceiling is $32,500 per year. If you're between 60 and 63, a provision called the Super Catch-Up raises it further to $35,750 annually. The government looked at the retirement gap and said, "We will give people in their 50s a larger shovel." Most people never pick it up. Let's put numbers to it. Someone who starts at 55 with nothing contributes $32,500 per year into a diversified portfolio returning 8% annually, would accumulate roughly $570,000 by age 67. Add even a modest employer match, add Social Security income. That's a retirement that looks nothing like the desperation the chart predicted. And there's more on the table: IRAs, spousal accounts, Social Security timing. Delaying benefits from 62 to 70 increases your monthly check by approximately 77%. For someone with limited savings, that single decision can outperform years of investing. Most people starting late never run these calculations. They see the two-line chart and stop there. Don't stop there. Section 3. The edge you didn't know you had. Here's something that almost nobody connects, and I think it's one of the most underappreciated ideas in personal finance. Older investors tend to be better investors, not because they're smarter, because they've already lost money before. When markets dropped sharply in early 2020, something predictable happened. Inexperienced investors panicked. They sold at the bottom. They locked in losses right before one of the fastest recoveries in market history. Within months, the market had fully recovered, but only for the people who stayed in it. Behavioral finance researchers have documented this consistently. The average investor dramatically underperforms the market not because they pick bad stocks, but because they buy when everything feels exciting and sell when everything feels terrifying. The emotional timing destroys returns more reliably than almost any other factor. A person in their 50s who has already lived through 2 or 3 market collapses carries something a 27-year-old doesn't. They know the world didn't end last time. That knowledge is worth more than people realize. And here's the part that almost nobody connects: knowing your actual risk tolerance, not the version you'd claim on a questionnaire, but the version that kept you awake at 2 a.m. during the last crash, lets you build a portfolio you'll actually stay in. And staying in is everything. Most people running out of time can't afford a single panic sell. Experienced investors are less likely to make that mistake. That's a structural edge. It just doesn't show up on a compound interest chart. Section 4. The trap that wipes people out. I need to be direct about something here, because the mistake I'm about to describe happens to people right after they decide to get serious, and it can do more damage than years of inaction. When someone realizes they're behind, the instinct is to try to make up the distance fast, so they start looking for faster returns, speculative bets, options, high-conviction tips, anything that feels like it could double quickly. The logic seems sound. If the math requires more growth, shouldn't I invest in things that grow more? Here's the problem. Things that can double quickly can also disappear quickly. When you're in your 50s with limited savings, a 50% loss isn't a setback you have decades to absorb. It can be irreversible. The window to rebuild is narrow, and the money that should have been working is gone. The boring strategy, diversified index funds, automatic contributions, staying invested through volatility, is boring because it works, not because it's exciting, because the market does the lifting for anyone patient enough to let it do it. The gap between aggressive and reckless is exactly where late-stage recoveries go wrong. Reliable growth beats spectacular growth that doesn't last. Every time, without exception. Section 5. The real reason people don't start. None of the math above matters if we don't talk about what's actually keeping people from acting. It isn't information. Most people could find everything I've said in an afternoon online. It's the story. The story says, I already failed. The door closed. Trying now is just proof that I should have done this 20 years ago. That story feels true. You can find evidence for it. But evidence can be assembled for almost any story. Here's the counter-evidence. Most Americans have almost nothing saved. The median retirement balance for people between 55 and 64 is around $185,000, far short of what most believe they need. You're not competing against some idealized disciplined saver from a financial ad. You're competing against the actual distribution of what real people have, and most have very little. You're not as far behind as you think. And here's the idea I want you to sit with. You're going to reach 65 either way, or 70 or 75. Time doesn't pause because you stopped engaging with your finances. Those years arrive regardless. The only question is whether the person who gets there has something or nothing. Nothing is the default outcome if the window stays closed. When someone first showed you a compound interest chart, the lesson was start early or regret it. What they didn't say is that this lesson applies at every age. The person who starts at 55 and then waits until 57 is also delaying. The cost is still real. The clock is still running. The lesson doesn't expire. It just gets more urgent. The honest summary. Starting late is not the same as starting wrong. The tools available to late starters, catch-up contribution limits, Social Security optimization, rising life expectancy, and hard-won market experience are real, and they're significant. The math isn't as favorable as starting at 25. It was never going to be. But the math of starting now is dramatically better than the math of starting never. The only financial decision that can't be recovered from is the one you keep postponing indefinitely. The identity close. The fact that you watched this far, past the uncomfortable charts, past the parts where the numbers aren't flattering, tells you something about yourself. You haven't decided to stop. You're still deciding. That kind of person doesn't need permission from a graph. They need a starting point. Open a compound interest calculator today, not to shame yourself, but to surprise yourself. Put in what you could realistically commit to, not a number that feels impressive. See what 15 years looks like. Then set up an automatic contribution before your next payday, even a small one. Habits are easier to grow than they are to start. Start first. If you want to go deeper on the specific accounts, how 401ks, Roth IRAs, and Social Security timing actually work together, the next video breaks that down step by step, specifically for people who are starting later than they planned.